Obsidian's database folder plugin is powerful and initially a bit overwhelming. So let's take a detailed look at it in this step-by-step guide. For using the database folder plugin, we also need the DataView plugin. While I have quite a few other community plugins installed, I only activated the DB folder and DataView ones for this video. For the DataView plugin, we need to enable inline queries, JavaScript queries, and inline JavaScript queries. If you don't know anything else about DataView queries, that's totally fine. The DB folder plugin also has a ton of settings, and I will go through all of them a bit later. For now, we just leave them be. Let's move on to creating our first database. There is a nice little helper for creating new databases, and after enabling the plugin, you should find it in your toolbar. If not, you can also use the command palette. If we click on Create a new database table in the toolbar, we get this dialog box with a few things to decide. First, our database's name. I will call it recipe. Then the plugin needs to know what the source for this database shall be. Here we have multiple options. We will look at each of those in turn, but for now we just stick to current folder. This will fill the database with all the nodes that are in the same folder as the database or in any of its subfolders. Then we need to let the plugin know where to store the database. There is no right or wrong choice. It depends on your respective use case. As a rule, I like to keep them in a dedicated folder, creatively called databases, although, like every good rule, this one also has exceptions. I will choose my lab folder for now. This is where I try all kinds of things in Obsidian. With that done, we can click on Create. Right away, we get an error message because there is no content to be pulled in and we have no database template defined. So the plugin creates an empty database with some default columns. All the settings we just defined and much more can be changed via the database settings dialog. We will look at them later, but I want to highlight a few right away. We can change the database source and have the same options as seen before. We can define a database name and description, always nice to know what things are about. The option Sticky First Column will freeze the first column of your database. That means if you have a table wider than your page and you scroll to the side, the first column will not disappear from view if the option is enabled. I will do that in our case. A bit further down under rows related configuration, we find an option to define the folder in which the plugin shall look for templates to be used when adding new rows. I will set this to a templates folder which I created earlier. And that's it for now as far as the database settings are concerned. Let's move on to the columns menu. If you click on the plus icon, this opens up and lets you do quite a few things. First, you can create new empty columns or add existing ones. Existing columns would come from the metadata of the nodes in the defined source. Additionally, we get a list of default columns based on file properties. We can toggle these on or off as we wish. For my little recipes example, I will only keep the file name and the file tags column. If I close the columns menu, we can see that these settings take effect immediately. Now, let's quickly create a template that the plugin can use when we add new items. We already configured the template location and now we just add the actual template. We keep this very simple. I only put the tags attribute into the front meta, and in the nodes body I have three main sections: ingredients, directions and nutrition. Now let's go back to our database and click on the plus symbol in the bottom left to add a new row. We give it a file name. I will start with blueberry scones. I make sure that the correct template is selected and confirm the creation. We can see in the background that the entry has been created. So I close the creation dialog and open the new node next to the database window. As expected, the plugin applied the template and we can start adding information. Let me quickly do that. As you can see, you don't see much just yet. Let's change this by jumping back into the columns menu. Now we are going to add a few columns to our database. First, I want to know how long it will take to prepare any given dish in my recipe database. So I add a column total time. When adding a column, we have quite a few formats to choose from. For the total time column, choosing the number format seems reasonable, so let's do that. As soon as I confirm the column creation, you can see that it shows up in a database table, but nothing happens to the recipe's front meta. That's okay. Next, I want to keep track of how hard any dish is to prepare. So I add a column difficulty and choose the select format for it. This allows me to define a set of values from which I can, select, hence the name, the appropriate one for each recipe. I will add 3 more columns. Type to identify whether a dish is for breakfast, lunch, dinner or anything else. This is a text column that allows me to select multiple values from a defined list. Cooked is a yes/no field that I use to track if I tried the recipe already. And lastly, I add a column called rating. where I can again select the value from 1 to 5 stars for each recipe. After adding all those columns, we can close the columns menu and go on to configure each of them individually. Remember that some of them are supposed to give us options to choose from. We still have to define these options. To do so, I click on the first column header and on settings. This opens the columns settings dialog. Here I go to the bottom and under add new label and value, I add my options for the difficulty. I stick to easy, medium and hard. I do have some issue here with displaying the options right away, so I have to close this dialog, open it again, and then I can define colors for each value. I would assume that this bug will be fixed in one of the next releases. Now I can click on a cell in the difficulty column and select one of the defined values. Once I do that, the front meta in my recipe also gets updated automatically. We can now see that I have the attribute difficulty with the value easy here. Of course, if I change the value in the database, it also updates the node. And this also works the other way around. But to see the changes, you need to close or navigate away from the database and then come back to it. Once again, the database is supposed to refresh automatically, but for whatever reason, it's not working properly for me here. Let me do the same for the type column. Here I can select multiple values and those will also show up in the front meta automatically. For the cooked column, we don't need to configure anything. If I check it, the front meta will show a true value for the attribute. And if I uncheck it, it will show false, as you would expect. The rating column also allows me to select a single value. Here I'm going to add 5 options for the star rating. Alright, things are taking shape. Let's add a few more recipes. Now that we know that this is working, let's organize our vault a bit better. Clearly, all these recipes and the database don't belong into my lab anymore. So I create a new folder under resources called recipes and move all the recipe nodes in there. But now my database is empty. Remember, we defined the current folder as the source for our database. Since it is still in the lab, but the recipe nodes are not, it cannot find them. We have 3 easy options to fix this. First, we can simply move the database to the recipe folder. Close and reopen it and we have all our recipes again. Second, if we prefer to have all our databases in the same folder, we can move it there and change the source settings to look for nodes with the tag recipe. This will search for matching nodes in our vault and pull them into the database. Third, we can use a simple data view query. If your vault is large, this might be a better option than searching by tag. In this query, we can define where to look for the nodes, making it faster to get the results. We can also add further parameters, but for now, a simple from statement is enough. Of course, you can add any other columns you want. For example, it might be useful to have the nutrition values as attributes rather than in line with the text. Or you could add a select column for the kind of cuisine a recipe belongs to. The possibilities are endless, and you can use all these attributes for searching and filtering your database. If you want to use the nutrition values as columns, but still have them in your node's main body, you can simply add a second colon, close and reopen the database, click on the plus symbol for add new column, and add them as before. To do this for all your recipes, you can update the nodes manually or add the values directly in the database. Or, if you have a lot of recipes, use a text editor like Notepad++ to open them all, search for the respective terms, and replace them with the same value plus an additional colon. Save them and reopen the database. But why bother with all these columns? Well, this brings us to the next nice feature of the database plugin, filters. When clicking on the filter icon in the top left corner of the database, a filter row opens up and lets you filter your database by any of the defined columns. For example, we could filter for dinner recipes only, and then we could say that we only want recipes with less than 450 calories per serving, and perhaps only those that we have not tried yet. Click the filter icon again to reset the database view. Additionally, you can also sort by columns and even have multiple sort levels. Let's say I want to sort my recipes first by their difficulty and then by the rating and number of calories. Now let's see how we can create a database if we already have a bunch of nodes. In my example, book nodes. As before, I click on Create a new database table in the toolbar and fill in the required settings in the dialog. After clicking Create, I immediately see a bunch of rows and the usual default columns. Let's quickly customize this by removing the unwanted columns, formatting the ones we want to keep, and adding new ones from the front meta in my book nodes. I also open the book node so we can see how this looks like. Okay, that's fine for now. By default, the plugin will only return the first 10 rows of results and create additional pages for the rest. In my example, we have 6 pages. We can adjust this in the database settings under pagination size. We can crank this up all the way to 200, but this might result in slow performance. I will just set it to 20. Scrolling through the list, we find many rows that seem to have no metadata. Opening one of these notes makes clear that these are not real book notes, but rather the Kindle highlights related to a book. This is not very clean, so let's filter those out. To do so, we go back to the database settings and add a where clause to our DataView query. In my case, I want to include only nodes that have the tag review/book. Okay, this is better. And now we also don't need the file tags column anymore, so let's hide it. Now let me sort this by status and author, rearrange the columns a bit, and there we go.
Oh, this might be a good time to ask you to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Thank you.
Okay, that's the database plugin and how to use it in a nutshell. Now, and this is important, let me give you the promised run through of the various settings, starting with the plugin settings themselves. To get to the plugin settings, click on the settings cog in the bottom left hand corner of Obsidian and click on DB folder. This is the highest level of settings for this plugin. Some of these can still be changed on a database level, which will supersede the general plugin settings. In the folder structure section, we can choose how compact or wide cells are. You can choose between compact, normal and wide. Here we can also turn sticky first column on or off. This makes the first column sticky so that it remains visible when scrolling horizontally. I already demonstrated it a bit earlier. Next, we can enable or disable the option to remove fields when a column is deleted. If enabled, deleting a column from the database view will also delete the related field from your nodes. So better be careful with that one. Then we have a few toggles for showing or hiding default metadata columns. They include the created and modified date. Note that these are the actual file dates, not the information in your front matter. File tasks would list any tasks that are part of a node when it is enabled. File in links lists all the incoming links for a node, and file out links lists all the outgoing links from a node respectively. The last one here is the file tags column, which, not surprisingly, shows all the tags a node has. For inline fields, remember the nutrition values I had in the recipes? We can decide whether new columns shall be created inside the node instead of the front matter by default, and if so, where to place them. We already know some of the rows related settings, such as the templates folder and pagination size. Additionally, you can change the font size and enable a row shadow if you like. Lastly, the show footer option is something I recommend turning on in the plugin settings and then keep it on or off on a database level as you need. What it does is to add a footer row to your database, which you can use for adding formulas. Depending on the column type, it automatically suggests to count unique, empty or filled values, or to calculate the percent of filled values. For number fields, you can also pick to sum all the values in a column or get the minimum and maximum values in this column. If we use this on our recipe database, we will automatically get the total nutrition values for calories, carbs, fat and proteins. Unfortunately, these values do not change if we filter items in the database, but perhaps this will come in a future update. In the editing engine section, we can define our preferred date and time formats. I left the default settings here as they match what I use in my Vault anyway. Automations lets you enable JavaScript formulas. As I don't know the first thing about those, I have it disabled for now. In the embedded media section, we can define the default state for media links and link aliases, as well as the default dimensions of embedded media, such as the book covers in my previous example. For exporting the database to a CSV file, we need to define a mandatory header key. Typically, this is the file name. We can also define whether the search or filter bar shall be visible by default, and whether we want the database to refresh automatically whenever any changes occur. Lastly, there are a few settings for developing and debugging. These are off by default and I left them that way. And this concludes the plugin settings. Let me quickly guide you through the next level of settings, the database settings. As mentioned, some of these overlap, and whatever you define on a database level will overrule the respective setting on the plugin level. To open the database settings, go to the respective database and use the Control Palette command. Open database settings. We have multiple options to choose from as a database source. The current folder option is what we had in the beginning, pulling in all the nodes that are in the same folder as the database or in this folder subfolders. Current folder without subfolders does the same thing, but obviously excludes any subfolders. Tag lets you specify one or more tags, and any nodes with these tags will be visible in the database. Outgoing link will match all the files that have links from the select file, and incoming link will match the files that have links to the selected file. Data view query lets you refine your database content by using queries, as we have seen before. We already discussed the destination folder, database name and description. The cell size and sticky first column settings work as they do on the plugin level, but only apply to the current database. In the columns configuration section, you can select one or more columns for automatically grouping nodes in subfolders. For example, I can pick rating, and any new entry will be placed in a subfolder for the node's respective rating. If you select more than one column, the folder hierarchy will be created accordingly, like in my example with rating and difficulty. The next toggle is related to this and lets you choose whether all files shall be grouped automatically or only those that get added or updated since you enabled the grouping option. If a file is missing one of the attributes needed for grouping, the next option lets you store them in the database's root folder by default and then clean them up later. The last option here is about removing fields from nodes when deleting a column, and we covered that one already in the plugin settings. If you find yourself creating databases that have at least some columns in common, you can define a columns template file and define it here. The plugin will grab only this file's metadata as columns. The list of files to choose from is provided from the use source. In this section, you can also tell the plugin to use all the fields from your nodes as columns. However, this is going to override any existing columns and needs to be considered very carefully. We already demonstrated the first two settings in the rows related configuration, the templates folder and pagination size. Additionally, you can adjust the font size and enable or disable the footer row, which we discussed in the plugin settings already. The next section is about the editing engine and, just as in the plugin settings, lets you define the date and time formats to be used. And at the bottom of the database settings page, we find the automation section, letting you enable or disable the use of JavaScript. We have seen the columns menu multiple times already. It still deserves its own moment in the spotlight due to its importance. We open the columns menu by clicking on the plus symbol next to the last column in the database. As we have seen, we can add empty columns of various types, I will come to those in a moment, or existing columns based on our node's metadata. But we can also show or hide various default columns related to a node's file properties and linking. Let's go through those. The file name is what you would expect. This column is shown by default and also serves as the unique identifier for CSV exports. The created date and modified date columns take their information from the file properties rather than a node's front matter. That means even if you have a created date defined in your front matter, the plugin will ignore it and show the file's creation date instead. The file task column shows a list of tasks inside a node. If I add a task to a node and reopen the database, it will be shown. Note that only incomplete tasks are listed here. Next, we have the file in links and file out links columns. As you would expect, this shows all the nodes that are linking to or linked from a node in our database. For example, I could link two recipes that are related, and after reopening the database, this link will show up as it should. The last column here is the file tags column. I'm not sure about its purpose. It takes the information from the tags attribute in the front matter. But if we add the tags column manually, it gives us more options, such as defining it as a tags column, color coding the tags, etc. Now that we know how to create columns, let's take a look at the various column types. We are already familiar with text, number, select, tags, and checkbox columns. But there are more types. A calendar column adds a date picker to your database. For our recipes example, this could be the date when I last cooked a certain dish. The selected date will be stored in a defined format and, as always, the attribute will be added to the node's front matter. The calendar time column works just the same way, but lets you pick a specific time in addition to a date. In my example, this is the time when I last ate the respective dish. A formula column lets you add custom JavaScript formulas and create outputs based on other values. As mentioned, I don't know much about JavaScript, so I will refer you to the plugin's documentation, the link to which I left in the description. The last two column types are relation and rollup. They work together and allow you to link to other databases or even to the same one for looking up values. As a quick example, I created create a relation with our books database. After creating the column, I go to the column settings and select the books database as the relationship target. Then I add a roll-up field for the books rating. In this column settings, I select the just established relation, select the action, in my case original value, but you can see various other options here, and select the property I want to return, which is rating. Back at the database, I can now select the related database's primary key, which is the file name, and it will automatically return the rating for the chosen item. Obviously, it does not make much sense to combine recipes and book reviews, but you get the idea. Speaking of column types, let's take a closer look at their respective settings. You can get to them via the columns menu and the settings cog next to a column's name, or simply by clicking on the column header and then clicking on settings. Here you can also change the column's header, which is not the same as its ID, type and sort order. You can add a new column to the left or right, hide and delete the column from here. Remember that if you activated the option to remove the field from notes, deleting the column will do just that, while hiding it will keep it in place. Which settings you can adjust depends on the column type. At the very least, and applicable to all the types, you can define a column ID. This is what you will see in a note's front matter and not to be confused with the column name as displayed in the database as the column's header. So if I change the ID of servings to servings1, we will see the change in the recipe notes too. Let's change this back and move on. With the inline field option, you can move an attribute from the front matter to the body text. Remember that servings is in a note's front matter, while the nutritional values for carbs, fat, etc. are inline fields in the text. In the style section, you can choose your preferred horizontal and vertical alignment of values inside each column's fields. And wrap content does what you would expect, wrapping long content to fit into your column. For select and tags columns, you get additional options. You can define which values shall be selectable and whether they come from a formula or are defined manually. You can also configure each value's color. Apart from that, you can move columns around as you wish to fit your needs. As you can see, the database folder plugin is quite powerful and, if I knew JavaScript, I could do even more with it. Perhaps I will find some time to get into it and do a follow-up video, if you guys are interested. If you'd rather want me to cover a different topic, let me know in the comments. In fact, this video was also created after a viewer asked for it. I hope this guide helps you to get familiar with this powerful and potentially overwhelming plugin. If you found this video even remotely helpful, perhaps drop a like, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell to make sure you won't miss the next videos. All this should allow you to save quite some time and be more productive. However, there are always more things we can do to increase our productivity, which you should really check out in this growing list of productivity tools and methods. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching and see you next time.